So, chapter 5, the newcomers. So, it's all about immigration. So, ask yourself, why did people immigrate to Canada? What would compel someone to leave everything that they know, that they've been comfortable with, where their history and family have always been, and move to a faraway, brand new place with a bunch of unknowns? Why? What would make you move? And so here we have some important terms that we're going to be covering in this chapter that you'll notice in your textbook as well. There's the Underground Railway, which is not a literal railway, but rather a series of places, posts, and homes that runaway slaves from down south in the United States would use in order to get to freedom. They would either go to the northern states where slavery was not allowed anymore, or they would make it all the way up to Canada where there was no slavery whatsoever. And so the Underground Railway was a bunch of people that would hide slaves for a night, and then they would move on to the next home, post, or hideout. While that was going on, there would be these bounty hunters, and they were hired by the slave owners in order to get their quote-unquote property back. So these were some of the reasons why they would leave. Well, slavery. Some other important terms that you need to know are persecution, discrimination, and dictatorship. These were some of the reasons why people left their home country and came to Canada. But once they got to Canada, well, what was their experience? What did they see? How did they live? And this is where homesteads comes in. Social reformers were people who tried to help immigrants. What was their type of technology? What did they use in order to farm the land? Because many of them were farmers, or rather became farmers. So Canada is a country built on immigration. And so this is a Heritage Minute video called Saudi. And it's a great view, great window into seeing what life was like in Canada, especially in the prairies. When you get a chance, open up the Google slide presentation for chapter 5 and watch this video. The last best West. The West was already filled, and that is in the United States. But the last best West, where there was plenty of fertile land, good farming land, was, well, in Canada. And so the way that they sold the prairies, especially to encourage settlement here, was, well, this is the last best West. So here's some important information. Land was cheap, like dirt cheap. No pun intended. $10 for 60 hectares of land. $10. Many immigrants settled in similar places. Gimli, Winkler, and Selkirk. So for example, the Mennonites. Many of them settled in Winkler. Mennonites is a type of, they have a Christian religion, and they follow a certain set of rules. Well, they came from places like Germany and some from the UK. Well, you would want to be with other Mennonites. So many of them settled in places like Steinbach and Winkler. Well, there was also a huge influx of immigrants from Iceland. Where did they go? Well, many of them went to Gimli. And if you're a fellow Icelander, well, you would want to be with your fellow people. And so there was another, essentially New Iceland that they would sometimes nickname Gimli because there was so much Icelandic people there. Selkirk was formerly a Scottish settlement led by Lord Selkirk, who came from Scotland, and he recruited people to move and settle in the Red River Valley, especially around the area of Selkirk. Well, it wasn't all fine and dandy. There were some challenges back home, and it's the reason why they left. Conditions were worse at home, especially in Europe and Asia. If you were an immigrant, especially if you were a poor person in Europe, you really had no chance to own your land. You had to work for wealthy landowners. So meaning you would work and work and work, but you could never own it yourself. Well, here you had the chance to own your own land. But not only that, huge 60 hectares of land for $10. Back home, you probably had no chance to send your children to school because you were probably too poor. There was nothing there. Well, the good Canadian government says you bring your family here and your children have a chance to go to school. In some countries in Europe and around the world, well, once you get to a certain age, you are forced to be in military service. Well, if you're in the military, the higher chance that you might get seriously hurt or even die. And so many people who didn't believe in violence or didn't want that type of lifestyle for their family, they left and came to Canada, where there was no forced military service. Some religious groups were also persecuted for their beliefs. Persecuted means to intentionally hurt someone because of who they are or what they are. In this case, the Doukhobors, the Mennonites, and Jews were persecuted in many of their own countries because of what they believed or their group. And in some countries, you had no rights. You had no political rights. You had no power. You had no voice. And so in Canada, you have the opportunity to have a voice. Here are some famous Canadian immigrants. Now, before I turn to the page, do you know of any famous Canadian immigrants? Well, our first Prime Minister, John A. Macdonald, he was a Scottish immigrant, and he became the first Prime Minister. Donovan Bailey. Now, in the 1990s, there was I believe it was the Atlanta Olympic Games, and he put Canada on the map. He won gold. Well, he was a sprinter from Jamaica, but he became a Canadian citizen, he trained in Canada, and he wanted to represent Canada. Are there any other famous immigrants that you know?